Whoa. All right. I am not sure what happened there. I think it didn't play the intro video. Are you all able to see and hear me? I don't know what happened there. I just got a failure message. Um, what's up, Mike? Yeah, maybe I should restart things. Ugh, I hate when that happens. Let's go with it. Mason, you're there. Can you hear me? I'm just making sure things work because I got some kind of error message as soon as I started. And what's up, Clashman? So Mason, you get 1,000 land salute. Again, I haven't had confirmation from people. Okay, you can. And Clashman the Third, you get 500. Great. Okay. Yeah, I don't know what happened. It didn't play my intro video. So let's play it. We gotta have that video, right? All right. Now we're in action. All right. So today I'm going to be reviewing a discussion from Sean Carroll's Mindscape podcast, where he had a guest on, Russ Shafer-Landau. Russ Shafer-Landau is one of the most prominent figures in meta ethics, in the like contemporary analytic meta ethics. That is a proponent of moral realism. He's written lots of books. He's got lots of articles. He's all over the place. Does a lot of work on this stuff. And so Sean Carroll is not a moral realist, and he had Russ on because they disagree, and they have a great discussion. I really like it. I think both of them are great representatives of their respective views. I think I probably disagree with both of them, so I think it should make for a good discussion. And I have had a few people say, I review a lot of like other YouTubers and stuff like that. So here I'm going to be reviewing, a very prominent proponent of non-naturalist moral realism, which, as you all know, that's the thing I critique the most. I'd love to talk to some naturalist realists too. Um, cool. I'm glad for the extra confirmation. So you say there was a countdown and we could hear it. Yeah, I know there was a countdown, but when I played my intro video, it said the video failed to load. StreamYard has been very naughty lately. There's been lots of problems, and it's still freezing up, so that's probably going to keep happening. And Sully Sullivan says Sean Carroll is the GOAT. Yeah, so I think Sean Carroll's great. One of my favorite videos from him is like explaining things at different levels of explanation. So where is that? Yeah, I'm gonna try to find the video. Yeah, here it is. It's from Wired. Physicist explains dimensions and 5 levels of difficulty. And he keeps like making it more and more complicated. I love that. The ability to explain things at different levels of complexity. Anyway, let's not goof around too much. The only other announcement that I will make is that I had a recent appearance on someone's podcast, Elijah Moore. I put a link to it in the post section here. So you could go check out my discussion over there. So I have another discussion coming out next week, in a few days. It's in a few days. So yeah, you've got more stuff from me coming out, but let's get into the stream. Okay, so here's the video. Pop it in the full screen. Let's get it started. How's the volume?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Mindscape podcast.
A very slightly low for me, so I'm going to bump it up just a little bit. Shouldn't affect you very much. Got to adjust my sound. Check one other thing. Right. There was one other thing I forgot to do, which is throw a link to the current stream in my Discord. If y'all don't know, I do have a Discord community, and you're welcome to go and join that. You could check the description for this video or any of my other videos. I always include a link tree, which has a link to all my other stuff. So you could find my blog there. You could find like my academic page there if you really want to check that out. You could find like ways to support me if you really want to do that. And you could find a link to the Discord community. So you can check all that out there. I rarely do this in videos, but I'll say right at the outset, like and subscribe, do all that stuff. I'm just throwing a link in my Discord right now, so people will know. People from there will know that I'm here, and we are all set. So let's get started. Oh, I forgot to mention. So we got Mason and Clashman. How do I say your name? Svez. You get 250 land salute. All right, let's get going. All right, there's a couple seconds in. Okay, there we go.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Mindscape podcast. I'm your host, Sean Carroll. I think that many of us are interested in trying to do the right thing in various contexts, but as we learn from Spike Lee's movie, as well as elsewhere, it can be hard to know what it means to do the right thing. And that's true both in a narrow sense and in a meta sense. In a literal sense, we don't know which thing to do is the right one. That's what Spike Lee investigated. But the meta sense is, what does it mean to say that something is the right thing? So there literally is within philosophy the study of ethics and moral philosophy, but then there's the study of meta ethics. What are the standards by which we defend a certain conception of what is morally right? I myself subscribe to something called moral constructivism, where I think that what exists out there in the world is the natural world, stuff behaving in certain ways in accordance with the laws of physics. Morality, I think, is something that we human beings, or presumably other conscious creatures out there in the cosmos, talk about and construct ourselves. And then it's very interesting to talk about, well, what things should we construct? How should we decide to be moral? And different people disagree and so forth. But I think that my point of view there is a minority one. I think that most people, both on the street and professional thinkers about this, are what we call moral realists.
So note right from the outset when he's setting this up, he says that he thinks most people on the street are moral realists. Now, it is true that a few survey philosophers have gone over this many times. The latest survey, the 2020 Phil Paper survey, found that 62% of the philosophers that responded to the survey and that answered the question about their meta-ethical views endorsed moral realism. So it does appear that at least among contemporary analytic philosophers, probably most of them are moral realists. Only 26% endorsed anti-realism, and then you had another remainder that chose a variety of other responses, but they didn't definitively pick realism or anti-realism. So you have more than a 2-to-1 ratio in favor of moral realists, at least from that sample, from a population that was predominantly analytic philosophy. Now, analytic philosophy is mostly associated with the Anglophone world, so the English-speaking philosophical academic world. There is continental philosophy, which is a somewhat different Western philosophical tradition. And then you have other philosophical traditions, and we don't have as much survey data on what people from other philosophical traditions endorse. And, I don't even know the total population of analytic philosophers versus non-analytic philosophers. So as far as philosophers go, we don't really have anything like definitive data on whether or not most of them are moral realists. We can at least say within predominantly Anglophone philosophy, it's very likely the case that most of them are moral realists. Note, though, it's not by an overwhelming majority. It's slightly above half. It did go up from the 2009 survey, but we're not talking some sort of consensus. 62% is not a consensus. And it's also worth noting that within that 62%, that it's fairly evenly split with a slight preponderance of those philosophers that endorse moral realism favoring naturalist realism, and the remainder endorsing non-naturalist realism. So it's 26.1% are anti-realists. I think it's 26.6% are non-naturalist realists. So it's only a 0.5% higher that are non-naturalists than are anti-realists. And then you have like 30 something, 32, 33% or something like that are naturalist realists. Now, why is that relevant? Well, I do have a very short article on this issue where I say that the real dividing lines are much more like rock, paper, scissors than they are like a dichotomy between two competing positions. And part of the reason for this is that naturalist realism is so different from non-naturalist realism that in some ways it's closer to anti-realism. At least with respect to many forms of naturalist realism, the stance-independent moral facts in question lack the kind of authority, clout, oomph, or force that the non-naturalist wants to extract from morality that they believe in, and the naturalist realist ends up with these rather anemic moral facts that may or may not have the kind of force that non-naturalists endorse. There are other reasons why one might question just how robust the naturalist account of realism actually is. In practice, a lot of it looks to me like it involves quite a bit of gerrymandering of language and various sorts of dubious claims about, how we ascribe meaning to things, and the facts in question end up being, in many cases, a kind of descriptive fact, where one could shrug and go, okay, those are facts if you say so, and it just really doesn't have much in the way of practical relevance. Whereas the non-naturalist is at least trying to say, hey, there are these facts that we're supposed to be responsive to. Now, some naturalists are probably going to argue that they can derive some type of authority or normativity that is more robust than something that's merely reducible to a description out of their accounts. I don't know how successful they are, but it's not at all clear to me that naturalism and non-naturalism should be lumped together as one supercategory. A case could be made that, conceptually speaking, naturalism has more in common with anti-realism than it does with realism. I'm sure a lot of philosophers would agree. When I said something like this to Mike Humer, I don't think he was on board. Maybe if I laid out my case, he might be more amenable to my perspective. I don't really know. I certainly don't think this is some sort of threat to non-naturalist realism in any direct sort of way. But you know, it's just a question of, a lot. If you look at the way that the dialectic works, a lot of non-naturalists are going to raise many of the same objections towards naturalism as anti-realists. So this is why it's kind of like dialectical rock, paper, scissors. Naturalists and anti-realists are going to raise many of the same objections to non-naturalism. Non-naturalists and naturalists are going to raise many of the same objections to anti-realism. And then non-naturalists and anti-realists are going to raise many of the same objections to naturalism. So, in other words, it's always two sides against the other for a lot of the way the arguments and objections work. Now, the other important thing to note here is that he says that, like, the person on the street he thinks is a moral realist. Sean Carroll's probably not aware of experimental meta-ethics, that there is empirical research that attempts to explore how non-philosophers think about moral realism and anti-realism. There are other avenues of exploration in experimental meta-ethics, but this is the really big one. So this is research. There's papers. Nichols and Folds Bennett, 2003 was an important paper. Nichols has another paper in 2004 that was pretty important. But the ball really got rolling with 2008's paper from Goodwin and Darley that looked into whether or not non-philosophers are realists or not. And there's subsequently been, I don't know, maybe a few dozen papers at this point that have employed various paradigms that look at whether non-philosophers are moral realists or anti-realists. The early studies showed very mixed results. You have two types of findings that you tend to get. You get interpersonal and intrapersonal variation. Interpersonal variation is an overall trend for some participants in these studies to favor moral realism and others to favor anti-realism. But you also get a really interesting one, intrapersonal variation, which is that the same participant would express a realist stance towards some moral issues and an anti-realist stance towards other moral issues. Technically speaking, if we want to classify those participants, we would probably call them realist. If you think there are some stance-independent moral facts, you're a realist. Kind of like if you think there's some gods, you're a theist. So some sorts of categorizations like that. It's like if you've got a little bit, you've got it all. So what's interesting about this research is that there were many methodological shortcomings with these early studies. Doesn't mean these studies weren't interesting and well designed and insightful and thoughtful and didn't introduce cool ideas, but it's very, very difficult to measure how non-philosophers think about these questions because it's hard. These are subtle, complicated, abstract concepts. It's hard to prompt people to think about them in the way that researchers want. In fact, I don't really think we can do it at all, but that's a story for another time. And I've talked about this in other videos. Here's basically what's happened. Thomas Pulser, Jennifer Wright, and a handful of other researchers, James Beebe, and a few others, myself and David Moss as well, we all were raising these sorts of methodological objections to these earlier studies. And Taylor Davis has a really cool paper too, came out a few years ago. We noticed and started working to minimize the influence of these various sorts of methodological shortcomings. Now, what happened once we started improving the design of the studies, really building on the previous researchers. So give them all the credit for pioneering the early paradigms. But, efforts to minimize those resulted in what? Well, much higher rates of anti-realist responses in a lot of the more recent studies. At the very least, you get pretty damn high rates. And Pulser and Wright in particular, and Pulser in more recent research where they did a cross-cultural study, found really high rates of anti-realism. So Pulser and Wright's, I think it's 2020 paper, Anti-Realist Pluralism, found that about 3/4 of the participants, this was people doing on online survey platforms and students in the United States, they found about 3/4 of the participants favored various anti-realist positions, with most of them favoring some form of individual subjectivism or cultural relativism. Error theory was not very popular, and neither was non-cognitivism. Taylor Davis in another study found very high rates of non-cognitivism. James Beebe in another paper found very high rates of non-cognitivism. As I said, Pulsar in more recent studies has more or less replicated similar findings of very high rates of anti-realism. Now, what's interesting about the 2020 paper with Pulsar and Wright is that this was replicated across 7 different measures. They found very high rates of anti-realism. So as the methods of these studies have gotten a little better, in some cases quite a lot better, the anti-realist rates have gone up, and they've gone up across a variety of different populations. You also have really interesting papers like Sarkisian et al.'s paper, Folk Moral Relativism, where as you render salient the cultural distance between two people that disagree, people increasingly favor the relativist or the anti-realist response options when they're provided. Now, what does all of that indicate? Does that indicate that participants are mostly anti-realists, at least in the populations that have been sampled from so far? It might look like that. I don't accept those results. I think that these studies continue to have significant methodological shortcomings, and what I actually think is going on is that participants are neither realists nor anti-realists. There's specific reasons why I think that the anti-realist rates appear to go up. But I think most of it has to do with people not interpreting the questions as intended. It might be that once you prompt people to reflect on realism, or it becomes increasingly clear what realism is, people may be less inclined to endorse it because you've disabused them of some of the misconceptions people about the viability of realism. But I don't know that that shows us that people were already inclined towards anti-realism prior to participating in these studies. Another major issue with these studies, and one reason that even if anti-realist rates, for instance, in the United States were really high, is that these studies may or may not generalize to broader populations. So, for instance, the studies that Pulsar and Wright conducted had participants from 2 populations. One of those populations was predominantly college students, and another population was people on these online survey platforms. I believe they use Amazon's Mechanical Turk. Now, student populations, if you look at Beebe and Sakras's, is it relativism or objectivism? And anyway, it's like a study looking at meta-ethics across the lifespan. They look at people's responses to these sorts of questions in different age brackets, and people in their late teens through about their mid to late 20s give the highest rates of the anti-realist responses. So college students in particular are more likely to give these anti-realist responses relative to other populations. And participants on Amazon's Mechanical Turk are disproportionately likely to be atheist and agnostic. And those populations, that tends to be correlated with giving anti-realist responses. So they may have inadvertently drawn on populations that are disproportionately likely to give higher rates of anti-realist responses. It's unclear whether you would find similar anti-realist response rates among other populations outside the United States. You do have Pulsar's cross-cultural study, though. So what's going on there? I am not entirely sure. It's something that would require quite a bit of more research to figure out what's going on. And it might be some of these populations are anti-realists. There's a few things I worry about. At least one of them would be that I'm worried that participants are not really interpreting the questions the way the researchers intend. Now, I've said a lot here. I think but it's important to note from the outset that Sean Carroll is doing what many people do when they discuss the topic of metaethics, which is buying into certain empirical assumptions about the sort of common sense or folk view. I don't like that term folk, but the view among people without formal training. Sean Carroll seems to be assuming that people without formal training are inclined towards moral realism. Essentially, the current state of the empirical literature is that there is virtually no empirical evidence that would suggest that that's true. We have unclear studies that are very difficult to interpret that get really mixed responses. As the methods have improved, we get increasingly high rates of anti-realist responses for most paradigms. Some paradigms find other mixed kinds of results. There's a few other studies that I could talk about, but what we do not find is consistent, clear, and unequivocal evidence across different paradigms of most people endorsing moral realism. In other words, we don't have good evidence that most people are anti-realists, but we also certainly do not have good evidence that most people are moral realists. Now, that's the state of the empirical literature. a lot of moral philosophers are going to base their claim that moral realism is the common sense or the folk view, not on empirical research, but on armchair theorizing about the way people appear to use sentences, predominantly sentences in the English language. There are massive methodological problems with this. Trying to extrapolate to facts about human psychology from isolated toy sentences. So basically, what philosophers will do is they'll take a sentence like "murder's wrong" and go, well, look, you can put the sentence, you could put moral claims that appear in sentences like this into a syllogism. So clearly, people aren't using them just to express their emotions; they're using them to make propositional claims. Okay, how often do people express syllogisms in everyday life? Do you hear anybody say, uh, all instances of stealing are wrong. Shoplifting is an instance of stealing, therefore shoplifting is wrong. I have never heard a non-philosopher say anything like that. You're not going to hear them doing modus ponens or modus tollens very often. Does that mean they never do it? No. But the issue here is that simply because it's possible to use moral language this way, it doesn't mean that that is the primary or typical way in which non-philosophers speak or employ moral language. They could primarily use moral language for expressive or imperatival, like to issue commands. They could primarily use them in those ways, even if it's possible to you sort of cram them into a syllogism. Now, that might slip under the radar of the way a lot of philosophers think about these things, because they typically seem to presuppose that certain types of discourse have a sort of rigid semantics. And I don't grant that that's true. And I think that to the extent that they presuppose that this is true, it's predicated on false beliefs and misconceptions about how ordinary language works. I should also say a lot of this is based off of making a bunch of assumptions about how ordinary people, non-philosophers, speak and think on the basis of anecdotal experience and, more importantly, focusing almost exclusively on contemporary English speakers. Like, this is almost entirely done in English. There's over 7,000 languages in the world. It's very weird to assume that if the sort of structure of English, current English appears appears to presuppose realism, that therefore everyone everywhere is a realist. That's a very weird claim to make. So I've covered a lot of this ground before, but it's really important to emphasize this. And who knows? Maybe you'll get very lucky, and Sean Carroll will see this and see that there is a person that does research on this, someone with a background in philosophy and psychology that specializes specifically in addressing the question of whether non-philosophers are moral realists or not, and is very skeptical that they are. And, Sean may take a step back and go, whoa, I was making an assumption here that most people are moral realists, but perhaps he may appreciate on reflection that that assumption may not be well founded, that the philosophical methods that philosophers have historically used are not very good methods for establishing such claims, and that the empirical evidence just isn't there. Okay, so I've said a lot. Let's get more into the video.
They think that in addition to the physical stuff of the universe, there is something else, some way of judging what is right and wrong. It might come.
Now, note specifically, I'm not going to dwell on this too much. He says they think. These are psychological claims. Sometimes philosophers will insist that they're making claims about the semantics of English or ordinary language or whatever it is, but they're not making claims about human psychology. Claims about how people think are claims about their psychology. So Sean here appears to be making an empirical claim about how people think. And again, there just is not good empirical evidence that most people think this way. So he's saying people think this way. What is he basing this on? How does he know this? I do find it very strange. This is just asserted all over the place that people think that there are, like, the person on the street thinks there's objective moral truths. Why do people say this sort of thing? I am very puzzled by this. Why people will just assert this is how people think. And, it's not like there's a bunch of evidence that this is the case. What is this based on? I don't know where this is coming from. I don't know why people are so confident about this. I've done videos where I'm like, look, it does not follow from theism that moral realism is true. It's not at all obvious that that's the case. And, people can sputter as much as they like and go, but it's obvious. No, it's not. And if you think it's obvious, maybe you're not thinking very well about the issue. If you think most people are moral realists, present the evidence for it. I'm still waiting for it, and I just haven't seen it. Now, I know I'm sounding a little bit argumentative and combative here. I'm not at all. Like, I have been consistently very, very impressed with how Sean Carroll has handled philosophical issues. He appears to me to be extremely open-minded, extremely receptive to correction on issues, very willing to change his mind, very willing to engage with people that disagree. I mean, it's literally a video where he's bringing on someone because they disagree with him. So, and I've seen Carroll raise amazing questions and be really insightful and thoughtful on philosophical matters. So this is not at all like hey, you're making a huge mistake here. I think he's making an assumption here. I think that assumption is very likely to be mistaken. But if you're not specializing in this topic, it's an understandable error to make. And there aren't too many people working in the field that would agree with me. So even if he went around asking philosophers, they'd probably be like, I have no idea who Lance is, and no, Lance is wrong. Most people are realists. Again, though, how do they know that? It's like this has just become some received wisdom passed down through the ages. It reminds me of the assistants to Daenerys Targaryen in Game of Thrones, where they were like, "It is known, it is known, it is known." It's not known. Just asserting something doesn't make it known. I do see some comments. Let me deal with those before we get a bit more into the video. Sapir is trying to promote the video. Click like. Yeah, please do. Appreciate it. Clem Grubern says, I don't know if philosophers analyzing moral language are trying to give a descriptive account of actual moral discourse from ordinary people. Well, you could check out my comment, my discussion about this over on the recent podcast that I was on with Elijah Moore. But let me give you some quotes, because I gave him some quotes, and I'll just read these off. These are quotes that were gathered. I gathered a much bigger list. I have to go dig it up at some point. But this is a list of quotes gathered by Walter Synod Armstrong. Here's a quote from A.J. Ayer. In every case in which one would commonly be said to be making an ethical judgment, the function of the relevant ethical word is purely emotive. Now, Ayer was an emotivist, and note what he says here. In every case in which one would commonly be said to be making an ethical judgment, the function of the relevant ethical word is purely emotive. So when he says in every case in which one would be commonly said to be making an ethical judgment, what commonly said sure sounds to me like he's describing ordinary language. Hare titled, again, this is from Synod Armstrong from the paper Mixed Up Metaethics. Hare from 1952 titled his work, The Language of Morals. Which language? And Synod Armstrong adds in parentheses, notice, quote, the one and only, the language of morals, not the languages of morals or something. We have from Blackburn, 1984. The point of expressive theories is to avoid the metaphysical and epistemological commitments and problems which realist theories of ethics are supposed to bring with them. Gibbard says, with normative language, we do mix plan with fact. On this point, I insist. An everyday normative term, though, may not express a plan-laden concept at all straightforwardly. Notice the reference to everyday moral language, and he says, we mix plan with fact. Another thing to note, look at the remark that Ayer makes. In every case in which one would commonly be said to making an ethical judgment, he says the function is purely emotive. He's not only saying that people or ordinary people in everyday circumstances use moral claims to express emotions rather than propositional claims. He's saying in every case in which they would commonly be said to be doing so, that they're doing so in a non-propositional way. And this kind of evidence was marshaled by Michael Gill to support his claim that 20th century philosophers presupposed not only various assumptions about how ordinary people speak and think about metaethics, but that they did so in a uniform and determinate way. Like if you take a sentence like murder is wrong, there is a singularly correct analysis of what sentences like murder is wrong mean. Now, also, I'll note seems so widespread. It's almost not even a dogma so much as just an implicit presumption that philosophers just seem to operate under. People will routinely say, well, what does moral sentences mean? And they want to give an analysis as though there is a correct analysis of what sentences mean, whether it be realism or anti-realism, cognitivism or non-cognitivism. They seem to assume there is a correct analysis to give. That's what Gill refers to as determinacy, and that there is one account to give. That's what he refers to as uniformity. And he calls this the uniformity determinacy assumption, or the UD assumption. And he argues against both. And he introduces two ideas, indeterminacy and variability. I'm a proponent of what he calls the indeterminacy variability, or IV thesis. I do lean more heavily on indeterminacy than variability, but basically I think that if you look over 20th century metaethics and what they were up to and what they were doing, it's very clear that they were trying to describe ordinary moral language and that they were making these sorts of assumptions. I'm going to give even more quotes because a lot of people question this, and I find it frustrating because it's so clear they're doing this that it's like I don't like people are just like they're not even doing this and they just are. And so I'll give a whole bunch. I'll give even more. Okay. Let's see. Timmons. Moral statements and their primary role are not assertions of a descriptive kind. Rather, they are evaluative assertions. Okay, let's give you some more. Brink from 1989. Non-cognitivists seem unable to capture the actual content of our moral judgments. Whose moral judgments are they talking about? Who's our? Is it just philosophers? So no, non-cognitivists seem unable to capture the actual content of our moral judgments. So Brink appears to be criticizing a metaethical position of exactly the kind we're talking about because of its failure to capture the content of our moral judgments. Who is our? If it's not ordinary people, who is it? We have this from Jackson. By the time I have finished, you will have before you a schematic account of the meaning of ethical ascriptions and sentences in purely descriptive terms. Note, by the way, Synod Armstrong is trying to capture Gill's claims about uniformity and determinacy, and he's really trying to show uniformity here, not so much the presumption that they're trying to capture ordinary language. I will show you a couple quotes that are much stronger support for that, especially the one from Mackey. Smith from 1994 says, we seem to think moral questions have correct answers, that the correct answers are made correct by objective moral facts. Who's we? Who is we? Okay, and then here's the one from Mackey. And this is the one that I think really clinches this. Here's from Mackey, 1977. This should be from Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong. Pretty early in the book. Okay, are you ready? All right, here we go. The ordinary user of moral language means to say something about whatever it is he characterizes morally. For example, a possible action, as it is in itself or would be if it were realized, and not about or even simply expressive of his or anyone else's relation to it. Terrible sentence. Very, very convoluted and confusing. I love Mackey, but this is a bad sentence. Note, though, that he's very explicitly talking about the ordinary user of moral language. How do I know that? Because he says the ordinary user of moral language. So, yeah, they are trying to talk about the ordinary users of moral language. I'll give you some remarks from Gill as well. Oh, yeah, there's some more quotes. So I'm going to give you even more, not even just from one paper. Okay, where are we at? Where are we at? So Gill has in a footnote at the start of his paper, Indeterminacy and Variability in Metaethics, he says, there are a number of different projects that can be called, quote, metaethical. I will focus here on only one of them, a project that can be called descriptive metaethics. The task of someone engaged in descriptive metaethics is to provide the best analysis of ordinary uses of moral terms. The descriptive task is different of determining what, if any, moral properties actually exist. The descriptive task, and he goes on, but he says this, the mid-20th century meta-ethicists I'm concerned with here are concerned with answers to the descriptive question. And he goes on to describe this distinction between descriptive meta-ethics and other sort of like ontological questions and that sort of thing. Here are some of the quotes that he provides. Okay. Stevenson says that his work is concerned to analyze, quote, the judgments of the ordinary man as he finishes reading the morning's newspaper. What else do we have? Oh, yeah. So let me read that one again, because it's just, again, it's so clear that this is the goal of these accounts that it's astonishing that people even question this. So Stevenson says his metaethical conclusions are, oh, right. Let me give the first quote. The judgments of the ordinary man as he finishes reading the morning newspaper. And then Gill goes on to say, and that his metaethical, quote, conclusions are based upon observation of ethical discussions in daily life and can be clarified and tested only by turning to that source. It does not get more clear than that. This is an account of how ordinary people speak and think. And yet there's more. So Gill goes on to say, Hare compares his task to that of the descriptive grammarian, and he says explicitly that he is giving an account of moral terms as they are used, not as they might be used. Now, note, Hare says that. Hare was a proponent of universal prescriptivism. And then you have Ayer, the other person that I quoted earlier about emotivism. So you have the two most prominent people that put non-cognitivism on the map were very explicitly saying that their goal was to describe ordinary language. It just doesn't get more clear than that. So, and insofar as cognitivism is contrasted with that, cognitivism and non-cognitivism, as it was initially framed, is a dispute about how ordinary people speak and think. That's how they framed it, and they framed it. It's not like that's an interpretation. They're explicitly saying that. So unless they don't mean what they appear to be saying, like they're saying, I like the ordinary person, what they mean, what they think. And yeah, I have philosophers say, yeah, it's not about what ordinary people mean or think. Okay, I mean that's a position you could take, but certainly other people that isn't the position that they take. Okay, yeah, and then he quotes Mackey from the same passages that Senator Armstrong does, saying Mackey makes it clear that he is trying to explain, quote, ordinary thought or, quote, ordinary user, what the ordinary user of language means to say. He goes, so this is again Gill saying, Smith says that he intends to give an account of the features of morality that are quote, that are manifest in ordinary moral practice as it is engaged in by ordinary folk. Are manifest in ordinary moral practice as it's engaged in by ordinary folk. So here we have Brink is not always as clearly descriptivist as Hare, Mackey, or Smith, but he too says that his account fits better than its rivals with, quote, common sense moral thinking. Thinking. So I really want philosophers to tell me with a straight face that their accounts better accord with common sense thought or thinking, but that they're not making psychological claims. Yeah, we're talking about how people think, but it has nothing to do with psychology. If thinking doesn't have to do with psychology, what does? Like, are you going to present me with a bunch of living organisms and say, yeah, biologists don't study organisms. They don't study living things. Of course they do. Chemistry, chemists don't study chemicals. So you have a bunch of chemists saying, yeah, here we got some chemicals. We're studying chemicals. Yeah, but chemistry is not really about chemicals. Sure. Okay. I mean, it's crystal clear. I hope I gave enough quotes to satisfy you. If I didn't, I don't know what I could do. All right. Let's get to some more quotes. Yeah, we got like what 1.5 minutes into the video, and I'm already 40 minutes in. This is how it goes, but we will get into more of this for sure. And if I have to make a multi-part video and say a lot of important things at the outset before we really get much into the video, that's fine. Okay, let's see. Andrew Moy says, do you think that the way philosophers try reading meaning off language is a product of them completely rejecting behaviorism and buying into some extremely strong form of cognitivism? You probably don't mean cognitivism in the sense that it's meant in metaethics, I presume. In any case, no, I don't, because the fall of behaviorism really, like, its decline was what, the late 1950s. Philosophers were already doing this sort of thing well before this, several decades before. No, I don't know why exactly philosophers always seem to have some disinterest in engaging with the matters in question empirically. There's a bunch of complicated reasons having to do with the history of analytic philosophy. You've got the linguistic turn. You've got the methods that emerged in analytic philosophy. You've got conceptual analysis. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on there. A lot of it has to do with philosophers thinking that you're not going to get much out of directly asking people questions about what they think, because people just are not going to be good at reporting these sorts of things. To people, pragmatic considerations are going to interfere with their ability to like get at the pure semantics of the sentences. Now, that's relying on assumptions about how language works. Where did those come from? Probably early views about how language works. And I think a lot of those views have just turned out to be wrong, or we will eventually, vindicate alternative conceptions of the way language works. Languages use views that emphasize a lot more pragmatics and the importance of context in determining what people mean in a given situation. A lot of this has to do with, I think, weird views about how language works. But those predate behaviorism. Yeah. If anything, it's more that these assumptions helped kill off behaviorism than that, than vice versa. Than that. It's in other words, it's not that, it's not that they rejected behaviorism and that led to these bad methods. It's that they already had what I take to be bad methods, bad assumptions, and misguided dogmas and misconceptions, and that eventually helped put some nails in the coffin of the dominance of behaviorism. But, I'm not a historian on this stuff. So if you know of any historians that would have an insightful perspective on the matter, do let me know and I'd be happy to bring them on. Yeah, so Plem Grubern says they're partly giving a normative account how we should or can understand our own moral utterances. Yeah, I don't think so. I think they're giving descriptive accounts. Now, this is something that Don Loeb and Michael Gill talk about. You can't allow for performance errors and other sorts of stuff. Like, it's not like no one's ever like mistakenly used the word dog or cat. That doesn't mean dogs refer to cats or cats refer to dogs. Someone might mistake a dog in the distance as a cat or vice versa, or like a little kid might not recognize immediately the distinction between dog and cat. So, these these descriptive accounts do allow for a certain degree of idealization, a bit of cleaning up of the messy stuff, performance errors, and non-imperfect overlap in how people use language. It's not like the word dog doesn't have a relatively stable meaning because some people would consider a coyote a dog and some people might not or something. There's stuff like that. Nevertheless, that mild degree of cleaning up is still largely subsumed by what is a descriptive rather than a normative account. At least that's my read on what people are up to here. So when you say they're partly giving a normative account, that might be true, but like how much of a part? Analytic philosophy says of the 2020 philosopher survey, I found only 1,785 philosophers responded when the target population was 7,685. Not sure if they would be a good criticism of the survey, though. I don't think it's a great criticism of the survey. We would need to have some reason to think that the people that responded systematically differ from the people that it was sent to, and the population that it was sent to is supposed to represent, that they're so different that the results are like uninformative. And I don't see any particularly good reason to think that. It might be that they targeted more secular institutions. Maybe if they targeted people with philosophical training and like theological seminaries and stuff like that, you'd get different results. But in this case, at least, if you did that, you would get even higher instances of realism. I don't know what would happen if you hit like smaller universities and places with like more adjunct professors. I think they had like minimum amounts of professors that had to be in the department and stuff. So the results aren't going to be imperfect. There's no way to actually perfectly randomly sample the population of philosophers. But I don't think that this sort of thing is going to be totally destructive to the meaningfulness of the results. You say, is this unusually low for surveys? I don't know much about surveys. Uh, what is that? It's about, looks like it's maybe around a quarter of them responded, maybe a little less than a quarter. I'm not going to do. It's about 2,000 out of about 8,000 if we round up generously. 25%. That's probably very high for response rates for these sorts of things. So that might actually be quite good. I don't know what the typical amount is, 10 or 15%. Someone could look it up for people responding to surveys like this. So that response rate looks quite good to me. Don't quote me on that, but I would bet, with some decent odds that that's actually a pretty good response rate. Yeah, Sapir says it's kind of frustrating. This is already a problem, and then someone with a fairly large platform following goes and adds to the problem by repeating the misconceptions and errors. That does frustrate me. It does frustrate me. I can't hold Sean Carroll too accountable for this though, because this isn't even something that's widely accepted among analytic philosophers. So who's he going to go to? To get like I'm one very very small voice, screaming into the wind, and very few people are listening to me. So can you really hold him accountable for repeating something in an area outside of his expertise and maybe he disagrees. Maybe even if he listened to me, you just go, nope, I don't agree. Most people I think are more realist. I don't know. People are entitled to disagree with me about this. Like I'm pretty confident I'm right. And I do a lot of work on this. Doesn't mean I'm guaranteed to be right. I could just be wrong about this. Plim Grubern says, it's true that explaining ordinary moral language is one of the desiderata of moral language theories, but other desiderata are coherence, explanatory power, parsimony, etc. Yeah, coherence, explanatory power, and parsimony of what though? Of the degree to which we're capturing how ordinary people speak and think. It's still just not the case. I don't think that the best way to approach this is armchair theorizing about decontextualized English sentences. So a sentence like murder is wrong. In what context? So, for me, technically, I think that decontextualized sentences have literally no meaning at all. I think sentences only have meanings in their contexts of usage. And so if you found an actual person in an actual street corner saying something like, that's just wrong, that person means something when they say that. But that's just wrong as a sentence. I don't think that and I mean this literally. Literally. The sentence that's just wrong, literally has no meaning. In fact, you could even take something like the cat is on the mat. Outside of context of usage, I think the sentence doesn't mean anything. Literally has no meaning. We could talk about the typical usage that sentence in the English language would have were someone to use it. But for me, talking about the sentence having a meaning is a bit like talking about the intentions of a description of an action. So imagine I say a person ran down the street. And then we ask, okay, why did the person run down the street? It's a nonsense question. The question doesn't make any sense. Only actual instances of people running down the street, assuming it's a voluntary action, there's going to be some reason what their some fact about what their intentions were. Actual people have intentions when they perform actions, but actions themselves don't have intentions. And I don't think sentences have meanings. Now, I could be wrong about that. I don't see how, but different people have different views about language. They think sentences have meanings. That sounds so ludicrous to me. It's almost inconceivable to me that and why this is such a widespread view. But if these are supposed to be theoretical virtues of what? Are they theoretical virtues of our empirical account of the communicative intent and function of certain types of sentences in a specific language in specific kinds of contexts? If so, great. Those are empirical questions, and we would need to get the relevant we need to be doing linguistics, maybe some comparative linguistics, cross-cultural psychological research. We would need to be doing like archival analysis. We would need to get transcriptions of people saying things. We need to get big data stuff. We'd want to look at what people say on Facebook and Twitter and Reddit and Instagram, and we want to analyze how people actually use sentences in real-world contexts. What I don't think would make any sense is to go, oh, what do I think people mean when they say this? As if that's going to tell you much about how people actually use these sentences. We don't theorize about human behavior this way, or at least we don't theorize about it very effectively by simply thinking, well, why do we think people do this? That's not going to give you much of a handle on how people actually think. If you want to study how people think, you got to look at their behavior, and you have to do stuff like cognitive psychology. So if people really wanted to know about ordinary moral language, they should actually study ordinary moral language. If philosophers take this to be empirical questions, then it's embarrassing that it took them until the 2000s to start seriously doing research on this, like that's last 15 years. If they don't take it to be an empirical question, what is all this question? It claims about how people think. They're not empirical questions. What the hell? So, if they think these are empirical questions, why aren't they doing empirical research? And why aren't they responsive to the empirical research? If they don't think they're empirical questions, whoa, that's even weirder. I mean, this is a dilemma that I don't see any way out of. All right. All right, we're getting more. So we're getting very, very, very tough to actually get into the video. Okay. Plim Gruber says, so it's not just explaining ordinary use, it's also possibly revising ordinary use if it turns out to go against other theoretical values. Okay, so revising it to what end? So you take ordinary language and then you're going to revise it. Even if you wanted to do that, even if you wanted to take ordinary language and then like fix it up, clean it up, right? So you're not just doing conceptual engineering in a vacuum. You're not just doing some sort of normative meta-ethical discourse where you're like, hey, here's how I think we should speak. If you're trying to say, okay, here's how we do speak, here's how to fix that. You still need to know what the actual content of it is. And to the extent that that's an empirical question, you still need to know what people are actually saying and doing when they engage in ordinary language. And again, you're going to run into this dilemma. If you're not doing empirical stuff, I'm going to have questions about that. I don't buy that there's anything to be doing here that's not empirical. Well, I mean, there's conceptual stuff. There's anything to be doing in the total isolation of relevant empirical considerations. I don't think this is an armchair enterprise. And if you are doing empirical stuff, okay, then let's actually do the studies. And then there's still the question of the generalizing. Even if you were doing these studies, are you studying just English speakers? What about the other languages? What about the other cultures that people are in? Are you looking at all of those? I mean, how do you even know all English speakers speak the same way? If you just study people in Florida, is that going to tell you about how people think in England? Is that going to tell you how people think in or speak in India? Maybe. How would you know? Philosophers are not entitled to just generalize because they freaking feel like it. Generalizing is incredibly difficult to do. Establishing the external validity of a study, establishing its generalizability from one population to another population, that's very tough empirical work. And philosophers are just not in a position to just presume that you could generalize from whatever populations you're familiar with to every other population. And they just make these presumptions all the time. So, philosophers will say stuff like the vast majority of people all through history have been moral realists. So they know Aramaic speakers are moral realists. They know the Pitaha are moral realists. They know everybody all through. How the hell would they know that? It's wild. Okay. So as far as revising it, revising it according to what standards? What if I like ordinary language and I don't want to, like, fixing it according to what standard? It's so I don't even know what that's supposed to be doing. But even if you were doing that, there could be different standards that you're revising it with respect to, like different target goals, and you would still need to know what it was. You can't revise something if you don't know what it is initially. Like, I can't edit a paper if you don't give me a paper to edit. You can't edit in a vacuum. Okay. Coffee Smug says it's kind of insane that meta-ethicists make claims about the meaning of moral utterances without much of any support from empirical studies, like bro, WTF. Right. Yeah. This just strikes me as madness. It's straight up like, 300. Like, you want to go, this is madness. And no, it's not Sparta. So I don't know what to do. Clem Grubern continues. As for we and ours, I think in at least some cases it just means a case of the royal we, and it just means the authors. It may or may not, but note all the instances in which they're very explicitly talking about ordinary people, common sense. I mean, I could have a paper that consists of like 30 pages of quotes. I gathered a big bunch of quotes in the past about this. I don't consider it to even be something, like, I will argue with it with people about it, but I don't really think there's a serious argument here. They were trying to describe ordinary moral thought and language. They clearly were. They clearly still are. And look, I'll just show you a recent paper I just posted about. I'll just show you one. Where is it? Here it is. Can I switch to this one? Yeah. Okay, take a look. Here's the highlighted section. Rather than agreeing that we should adopt moral abolitionism, in light of compelling arguments against suggesting that the folk notion of morality is untenable. The folk notion. So this whole argument is based, and let's keep reading. Okay. Rather than agreeing that we should adopt moral abolitionism in light of compelling arguments suggesting that the folk notion of morality is untenable, here are the authors referencing error theory, which is a rejection of moral realism on the basis of what? On the basis of this is what ordinary people mean when they make moral claims. Ordinary people are wrong, and they're trying to describe these facts that don't exist. A big part of that thesis turns on claims about what ordinary people mean. We could just go back to Mackey, who explicitly says so. I mean, that's just what the view is. Now, Mackey's views are a little more complicated than a lot of the sort of like crude error theory you see here, but Mackey was still engaged in this descriptive enterprise. But if you don't believe me that this is presupposing moral realism, let's continue. Let's start from the beginning. Rather than agreeing that we should adopt moral abolitionism in light of compelling arguments suggesting that the folk notion of morality is untenable, one may argue that there are more philosophically plausible conceptions of morality available to us. In this chapter, I consider some of these alternatives. One possible maneuver is to suggest that while a kind of morality based upon objective mind independent properties is difficult to defend, a constructivist moral perspective based on other cultural and personal values could do the trick. So note the presumption here. Folk notion of morality here is presumptively realist. This is very, very standard for philosophers. It's so standard for philosophers. Again, I find it very strange that people are like super duper skeptical that philosophers are clear. Like, to me, people are super duper skeptical that philosophers are claiming ordinary people are moral realists. They think like moral realists. They speak like moral realists. They're committed implicitly to moral realists, to moral realism. You also have other appeals which appeal to the phenomenology of moral experience. So philosophers will routinely say things like we experience morality as a realm of objective truth, that sort of thing. So they also appeal to the phenomenology of morality. So this is super common. You could also look at Neil Sinclair's paper on the presumption of moral realism. There's a more recent paper looking at the presumption of moral realism. Franzen, I think, is the author, and this is just so common. It does strike me as quite strange for people to continue to argue against it. All right. Plem Grubern says, but even if it's historically true, the 20th century meta-ethicists are trying to explain folk moral discourse. That doesn't mean meta-ethicists today are or should be doing the same. Yeah, but they are. They are doing that, though. Okay. Joe Smith says, surely there must be a way to design a better study to capture how people think. Couldn't you ask a bunch of follow-up questions about what they mean by X is wrong and what they mean by wrong? Yes, that's what I did in my dissertation. And no, I don't think it really helps you design a better study. If you want to see, I have a more extensive discussion about that with Joe Schmid on Majesty of Reason. So you could check that out. I'll just very briefly summarize the issue. Uh, I don't think it's possible to design a better study because I don't think that non-philosophers are realists or anti-realists. So I don't think you could figure out whether or not they are realists or anti-realists because I don't think that's a feature of the way ordinary people speak, think, or act when it comes to morality. So I think philosophers are basically, and experimental philosophers too, are presupposing that people must be one or the other. And it's just a question of which one they are. I think they're neither. And it's just not part of the way people think. Gill gives a great example in his paper on indeterminacy and variability, where he says, do we suppose that when people are like adding up numbers and doing math in everyday life, that they must be either mathematical Platonists or anti-Platonists? It's a rhetorical question. He thinks the answer is clearly no, probably not. They don't need to endorse those views. The example I use in my research is asking whether when people make causal claims that they have to have some kind of commitment or belief about how to interpret quantum mechanics. Are they Copenhagians? Are they mini worlders? Do they endorse like Bohm, like hidden variable theories? No, they don't need to endorse any of these. They don't know what they are. They wouldn't understand them if you've told them about them. This is not a feature of the way ordinary people make causal claims, and they don't have to have implicit commitments about these sorts of things. And I think it's the same is true for morality. People simply are not realists or anti-realists, I don't think. I mean, they can become them, but they become them by studying or reflecting or thinking about philosophy. But it's not like a built-in feature of everyday moral language. At least that's my position. All right. Clem Grubern. I love when I get. By the way, if I'm arguing with you, it's because it's fun. Yeah, I think the stuff is worth engaging with. So if we don't get to the video, that's fine. I can always do more. Clem Grubin says, take something like the Frege-Geach problem. Why would that be a problem if our goal is purely descriptive? If actual moral discourse is incoherent, our description should be incoherent. Yeah, it might be incoherent though. And then, yeah, sure. Then ordinary language turns out to be incoherent. So Don Loeb argues for this. And I've had Don Loeb on the channel. Don Loeb has a great paper, has a really cool title. I think it's called Moral Incoherentism, How to Pull a Metaphysical Rabbit Out of a Semantic Hat. And he argues for a new type of anti-realism called incoherentism, where he argues that people have inelimitably conflicting commitments to, say, both cognitivism, non-cognitivism, realism, anti-realism, various sorts of views, and that because those commitments are internally contradictory, that ordinary moral discourse is incoherent. And so you get something you might think that's a bit like error theory, but it's not that ordinary moral language is committed to false presuppositions. It's that it's committed to presuppositions that are logically contradictory as they conflict with one another. And so it's incoherent. Plum Grubin continues. It just doesn't make sense to me to be bothered by those kinds of problems if the goal is just descriptive. Are philosophers assuming ordinary speakers are incapable of error? No, they're not assuming they're incapable of error. And the people that are critiquing this sort of thing don't assume that either. So, Gill talks about this in his paper. So does Loeb in his paper addressing this question. Plum Grubin says, but I agree the assumption that ordinary people are moral realists is unfounded. So, okay, fair enough. I don't even think it's well defended on the armchair grounds. So, one of the papers I talked about recently, I'll mention this. In fact, I'll just show you. Why not? Might as well show you because it's cool. Let's see. Oh no! 1 second. This is the wrong post. Here it is. There we go. So this was a blog post that I wrote where I brought up some of this research. Let me get to it. Here it is. Okay, so I'll just, I'll just read it. Why not? Here's what I wrote. Franzen draws on the literature on subjective attitude verbs. According to Franzen, subjective attitude verbs, quote, designate a kind of attitude that an individual can only have towards a class of contents which are intuitively subjective, end quote. In English, fines serves as an example, though Franzen notes that English exhibits idiosyncrasies that make it less than ideal for conveying the general issue. Consider this example adapted from Franzen. Alex finds pineapple on pizza tasty. This sounds perfectly copacetic. Now consider this remark. Alex finds that pineapple is a fruit. This doesn't sound right. English speakers wouldn't typically say that one finds factual claims like this to be the case. Franzen gives another pair of examples to cement the point. Carl finds Tuesday nights boring. Sounds perfectly fine, right? Carl finds it Tuesday. That sounds weird. The former is a normal locution, the latter isn't. Franzen quotes, I don't know how to say this, Sabo, who says, there is an intuition that it does not make sense to entertain a subjective attitude to something which is either a fact or not a fact, regardless of the subject of the attitude. So, as I say here, I'm not a fan of intuition talk, nor the vague notion that there is an intuition. Intuitions are something that, if they exist at all, are things people have. There aren't just intuitions floating in the ether. I wish philosophers would be more careful about this sort of thing. Nevertheless, if we grant Sabo is correct about how we use the term find in English, we can apply this to moral cases. Franzen applies subjective attitude verbs to moral claims, noting that they don't appear to be a poor fit in such cases. And here's a quote. The observation speaks firmly against the hypothesis, since moral predicates, unlike objective predicates, interact felicitously with subjective attitudes. That is, one can felicitously assert sentences like, Carl finds it wrong to eat meat. Carl finds the government's stance on climate change morally reprehensible. Carl finds the EU's new immigration laws cruel. In other words, for things that are presumptively subjective, like Carl finds pineapple on pizza to be tasty, though, in other words, a category we would take it to be stance dependent or anti-realist or whatever, saying someone finds it to be the case sounds perfectly fine. But it doesn't sound that way for things that we might presumptively take to be stance independently true. And so given that dichotomy where we use these subjective attitude verbs for anti-realist type of normative claims, but we don't use it for realist type claims, we then ask the question, well, which better fits with the way ordinary moral speakers of English speak? Looks like, again, this is the armchair analysis, looks like it better fits with anti-realism than with realism. Because the moral claims function more like the subjective claims than they do like the objective claims. So right there, again, this is armchair stuff, that this is some evidence from an armchair perspective that favors anti-realism as a better description of ordinary moral language. Note, Franzen is also here explicitly sensitive to how this works in other languages, and it argues that it actually is more clear that it works this way in a variety of other languages that Franzen goes on to mention. I didn't get to the rest of the paper here in this article, but the general point is that it looks to me like a lot of philosophers are engaged in a degree of motivated reasoning. They're looking at the stuff that seems to support from the perspective of describing ordinary English sentences, moral realism, and they seem to downplay this sort of thing, and that's really, really okay. And then Alex says, I was so jarred by Russ Shafer-Landau. I listened to one of his debates, treasuring babies for fun, not being objectively wrong. No disambiguation, no nothing. I was shocked. I think the last letter that got cut off. Okay, so it looks like I only got into the sort of the like a kind of abstract of covering the video. Because I didn't really get into the video. I am going to have to keep going for now, and then we'll return and we'll play more of the video. So I think that might be a record for me for how little of the video I actually played. I got 1 minute and 33 seconds into the video, and we've got an hour and a half to go. But there was a lot to say there, and I will do a part 2, and we will get more into the video. So I will see you all later on. I don't know if I'm going to be up for it tonight. I'm about to go have dinner. I might be too tired afterwards, but if I could do more, I will do more. But in any case, you will see me soon in the next week or two covering some more of this. So thanks everybody for being here. Thanks so much, Plem Gruben in particular, for pushing back and pressing me on some of these questions. I hope my responses were at least useful or interesting, even if you ultimately don't agree with some considerations. And Plem Gruben says, thanks for the discussion. Good night. A few other people thanking me. Okay, so we will continue this. I am dedicated, as I said, to covering every video on meta ethics on the internet. We'll get to them all, and I will finish this one up. So I'll see you on a little bit. I'm going to go spend some time with my family. So take care, everybody. Do please go check out the original video. Give a like and subscribe to Sean Carroll. Sean Carroll's awesome. You could go listen to the video while I'm away if you want. Check out the video. The link is in the description. It's also on podcasts and stuff in other places. Check out my recent podcast appearance on Elijah's podcast. And I will see you all later. Hopefully in an hour or two, I might be back, but we'll see. All right, everybody, take care.